In this video, we're going to begin to add some of the functionality behind the user interface components that we have. We'll also replace the center button with our JList and add some data to the list as well to make sure that that works. So let's start to add some functionality. The first thing that we'll do is we will add our JList into our user interface instead of the center button. So first things first, I'm going to delete my variable for the center button, and I'm going to add JList components to my user interface. So I'm going to say private JList, and I'm going to call the JList log list. Now the JList is going to store or show items in a list format, but we're going to use something alongside the JList to allow us to add data to the list, and we're going to use something called a default list model. So I'm going to say private default list model, and I'm going to call this variable data model. So this is a common approach in graphical user interface design. You have a component that actually looks after the display of the data, and then you have a component that actually looks after the data itself. This is known as a model view controller, where you have a model to hold the data, you have a view which just looks after presenting that data on screen, and you control the information by communicating with the data model itself. It sounds complicated, but it's actually very easy to use. So we've got our JList and our data model set up, and remember, I've removed the center button. So all I need to do now is create those objects. So I'm going to get rid of the center button, and I'm going to create the JList and the data model. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is create the data model, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to say data model equals new default list model, and then I'll create the JList. So I'll say log list equals new JList, and when I create the JList, I'm going to tell it which data model to use. In other words, where to get its data from and how to interact with its data, and it's going to do that through my data model. So that's why I created the data model object first, so that I could tell the JList, look, use this data model. This is where you're going to extract the data from to display it on screen from this data model. So the next thing that I'm going to do is, instead of using the center button in the border layout.center, I'm just going to very simply add the log list, the JList, to the border layout rather than the center button. So I'm going to use log list, and I'm going to go down to where I've added my components into the border layout, and simply just remove the button center and put in log list. So now the center will contain a list. Just before I go and test this out, what I will also do is I'll also add in my action listeners. So I'll say my class extends JFrame, and as usual implements action listener. Now, of course, there's a few steps involved in this. I'll say implement ActionListener, and I also have to provide the ActionListener method. So let's do that. So let's say public void action performed, and of course that's an action event, and the argument that we pass over is A. So what we'll do here is we'll add in the if statements to check to see if the load or remove buttons have been pressed. So we'll say if e.get action command dot equals load, and then we'll have else if e.get action command dot equals remove. So what we can do for the moment in here is we can actually just test to see whether or not our JList is working. And to do that, we'll use the data model. So when the person clicks on load, or when the user clicks on load, we can just, for the moment, test our JList out by saying data model dot add element. So we're going to add a piece of data to our data model. So add element, and I'm just going to add in a string. So let's just say item. Okay. So hopefully when the user clicks on the load button, the data model will get a new item added into it, which is just a string, and hopefully we should see that in our list. Now, when the user clicks on remove, I want to remove the selected item from the list. So in order to do that, I need to know what the selected item is. So I'll say int selected equals. And to get the selected item, I'm going to say log list, which is my JList object, dot get selected index. So what this method on the log list does is, if there's an item selected, it will return its index. Very similar to items in an array. You've got items in a list, and if there's something selected, this method will return its index, and we'll store that in our variable called selected. So if there's something selected, it will be stored in selected. If there's nothing selected in the list, selected will have a -1. So the get selected index method will return -1 if there's nothing selected. Now I only want to attempt to remove something if there is something selected. So to just check for that, I'll say if selected is not equal to -1, then we know we're safe. There's something there that we can remove. So if selected is not equal to -1, then what I will do is I will say data model dot remove and I want to remove the element or the item at that position selected. So we've added in our JList components, the JList object and a data model for the list. Then we have created the data list model, and when we created the JList we added the data list model to it. And then we've added in our implements ActionListener to our class definition. And we've added in our action performed method with some if statements that trap the click on the load button and the click on the remove. And in the load button we're going to add something to the list, just some temporary item. And then in the remove, hopefully we will be able to select an item and remove it from the list. What we're missing is we need to tell our buttons load and remove. We need to tell them where to send their events. And to do this we'll say button load dot add action listener this. And we'll also say button remove dot add action listener this. Okay, so we've changed quite a bit of code here, so hopefully there's no syntax errors. I'll just save it and compile. And let's run this and see what happens. Okay, so we've got our log viewer application. We can see that I'm clicking in the center, so there's no button there. So let's click on load, and you can see that it's adding an item to the list. And we can click on an item in the list and then click on remove, and you can see that it's removing the items from the list. So the functionality of our list is working. All we got to get it to do now is to display the log file contents. Okay, so far so good. So let's add some more functionality to this. So let's go down to our action performed. Okay, so I don't just want to add pieces of text to my data model. I want to add the contents of the log file. So to do that, I'm going to actually create a new method to load information from a file into the list. So I'll create a new method called public void load log file, and this is going to take as an argument a string which will be the file name that we want to load. So in here we will do our usual file IO stuff, which will need a try and catch block. And in the event that the file can't be loaded, if something happens that we can't load the file, what we'll do is we'll actually output a message into the label at the bottom of the screen to inform the user that we could not load the file. So in order to do that, I'll say lbl message dot set text, and I'll just output a simple error message here. So I can say error, could not load file, and then I'd like to append the file name onto this so the error message is a little bit meaningful. Error, could not load file, and then I'll use the file name variable so that we get some meaningful output. So when the file is not loaded, we'll get an error message at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so let's write the code now to load the file. So I'm going to use a file reader, and that will be equal to a new file reader, and that will read from the file name that's passed in, and then I'll use a buffered reader in equals new buffered reader, so I get the spelling of it right. Buffered reader, and a buffered reader on this side as well. And buffered reader, and that will be using the file that I just created. This file reader object will be passed over to that buffered reader. And then I'll say string s equals in dot read line. So this will read a line from the text file. And what I want to do is continue to read lines from the text file as long as there are lines to read. So I'll need a loop. So I'll say while s is not equal to null. So as long as there are files, or as long as there are lines to read in the text file, keep on looping around. And in here what I'll want to do is, every time I read a line from the file, I'd like to add it to my list. So I'll say data model dot add element. And what do I want to add? Well, I've just read a line from the text file in .readLine, and I've stored it in the variable string s. So I'll want to add s to my data model. So when I add that to the data model, I want to read the next line to make sure that the loop eventually gets to the end of the file. So I'll say s equals in dot readLine. If I omitted this piece of code, the loop wouldn't progress and would continuously loop around endlessly. Hopefully, if everything has worked, then I can close the file. So I'll say in.close. And I'll also want to output some kind of message to the bottom of the screen. So I'll say lbl message dot set text, and we'll output some nice information here. So we'll say the name of the file, we'll say successfully loaded, and we'll also maybe say how many items were loaded from the file, and we can do that by using, we can concatenate on data model dot get size. So when we add all of those items to the data model, the get size method on the data model will return how many items have been added to that data model. And we'll say that many items added to list. So this message will say whatever file name was loaded, successfully loaded, and then we'll have a number of items given by datamodel.getSize, items added to list. So we'll know how many lines were in the log file. So now that we have that method declared and implemented, we need to go back to our action performed, and instead of adding just strings to the list, what we'll do is every time the user clicks on the load button, we will first of all remove all the items from the list. So if there's any items in the list, we will remove all elements from the list by calling remove all elements on the data model. So if there's some remnants of information already left in the data model, we'll clear it out by saying data model.remove all elements, and then what we want to do is we want to load the information from our log file. So we'll call load log file. Now what file do we want to load? Well, that's going to be given by the user typing the file name into the text box. So the text box that we used was a JText field and it had txt file name. So the user hopefully will have loaded or typed in the name of the file that they want to load into that. So when we make the call to load log file, we would like to pass over the contents of that JText field. So to do that, we say txt filename dot get text. Okay, again, we've made a lot of changes here, so hopefully there are no syntax errors. So we'll save it and compile, and let's run. So here's our application. Let's try and click on load with no file name. So when we click on load with no file name, of course it's not going to be able to open that file, and you can see we get an error message. Error, could not load file. Okay, let's put in a file name. So the name of the file is login underscore failures.txt, and click on load. And as you can see, all the text is read in line by line from the file and added to our data model, and our JList looks after displaying that. So there's the login failures.txt, and you can see our message printed out at the bottom of the screen. Login failures.txt successfully loaded and 16 items added to the list. Let's try login success.txt. So this time when we click on load, remember it's going to clear the list out and load in the new file. And there we have the successful logins added to our list. And again, login success successfully added, and this time 6 items added to the list. And again, we can click on an item and then click on remove to remove that item from the list. So there's quite a lot of functionality added there, and in the next video we'll tidy up some of the user interface components and add a little bit more functionality to the J text field area.